The Senate chamber was heavy that afternoon, humid with tension and lit by the pale gold of late sunlight bleeding through the high windows. Senator John Kennedy sat calmly at his desk, flipping through a binder marked Fiscal Reform Hearing. The sound of papers rustling was interrupted by a voice echoing across the floor, sharp, self-righteous, and unmistakably performative. Thomas Massie was on his feet again. "What this government needs," Massie declared, his southern drawl sharpened by frustration, "is less talk and more truth. We can't spend our way out of a hole." Cameras turned, interns froze mid-note, and even seasoned staffers exchanged looks. Kennedy glanced up, his lips tightening in that half-smirk that meant trouble was coming. Massie's words rolled on, gathering speed. "These so-called conservatives voting for bloated budgets aren't defenders of liberty, they're enablers of corruption." He paused, eyes scanning the chamber for approval, but found only silence. Kennedy finally leaned back in his chair, his voice breaking through the stillness like a whip crack. "Tom," he drawled slowly, "you remind me of a rooster who thinks he started the sunrise just because he crowed at dawn." A ripple of laughter cut through the chamber, brief but lethal. Massie froze, then turned toward Kennedy, jaw set. Kennedy rose, buttoning his suit jacket with practiced calm. "Now, I admire a man with conviction," he said, walking toward the podium, "but conviction without cooperation just makes noise. You can't lead the orchestra if you're too busy tuning your own horn." His tone was even, his cadence deliberate, folksy charm layered over razor-sharp logic. Massie opened his mouth to respond, but Kennedy wasn't finished. "We came here to govern, not grandstand. Liberty ain't theater, son, it's responsibility." The room fell silent again, this time not from shock, but from recognition. Kennedy didn't shout, he didn't need to. His words landed heavy and final. Even Massie's allies shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The lone wolf had howled, but the pack had already moved on. The clip hit social media before the session even ended. Kennedy's words, "Liberty ain't theater, son, it's responsibility," echoed across platforms, shared, remixed, and captioned with phrases like, "Kennedy just ended him," and "That's how a statesman handles drama." By sunset, the exchange had gone viral, igniting debate across partisan lines. Some praised Kennedy for calling out attention politics, while others rallied behind Massie, hailing him as the last true constitutional purist. But Kennedy didn't care about the noise. He never did. He cared about results. Later that evening, in his dimly lit Senate office, Kennedy sat with a mug of chicory coffee, reviewing headlines that buzzed on his tablet. Massie melts down in fiscal hearing. Kennedy's one-liner steals the show. He sighed, tapping the screen dark. "Lord, they'll turn anything into entertainment," he muttered, leaning back in his leather chair. His chief of staff, Rachel, peeked through the doorway. "Senator, Massie's team just went live on X. He's accusing you of being a sellout to big government." Kennedy didn't even flinch. "Of course he did," he said dryly. A man out of arguments always reaches for outrage. On the other side of town, Thomas Massie's face filled a smartphone screen, lit by the glow of ring lights. "Kennedy talks about cooperation," Massie declared, "but what he really means is compromise with the same bureaucracy that's strangling liberty." His followers cheered in the comments, hashtags flooding in, #TrueConservative, #StandWithMassie. Back at the Capitol, Kennedy stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker. "You can't save a drowning man who refuses your hand," he murmured to himself. He knew this wasn't just a spat, it was a sign of something deeper. The conservative movement he'd once known was fracturing between pragmatists and purists, and Massie was clawing at the cracks for clout. Kennedy rubbed his temple, whispering under his breath, "Attention's cheap, but leadership's expensive." He'd make that point clear, on the record, where it mattered most. Tomorrow, the floor would be his again. The next morning, the Capitol buzzed with tension. Reporters lined the marble hallways, microphones in hand, waiting for Kennedy's next move. Thomas Massie had spent the night fanning the flames, calling Kennedy a career politician and accusing him of betraying conservative values. The headlines were brutal: Republican civil war erupts on the Hill, and Massie says Kennedy's lost his backbone. But when Senator John Kennedy stepped out of his office, there was no anger in his eyes, just the calm resolve of a man who'd been through tougher storms. "Morning, y'all," he said with that signature Louisiana drawl, straightening his tie. "I hear I've been promoted to public enemy #1 again." The reporters chuckled, but Kennedy didn't stop. "You know, I like Thomas. I really do. But there's a difference between fighting for principles and fighting for attention, and right now, he's wrestling with the wrong one." The words hit every network within the hour. Meanwhile, Massie doubled down, appearing on a podcast where he painted Kennedy as a relic of the establishment. "He talks about responsibility," Massie said, "but responsibility without courage is just compliance." His tone was sharp, almost rehearsed. Back in the Senate chamber, Kennedy took the floor again. The room quieted instantly. "You know," he began, pacing slowly, "I've met a lot of men who call themselves rebels. Some of them were heroes. Most were just loud." Laughter rippled softly, but his tone shifted, growing heavy with meaning. "Thomas talks about courage. I'll give him this, he's got plenty of bark. But barking ain't governing." C-SPAN's camera zoomed in as Kennedy leaned on the podium. "We're not here to burn the house down just to prove we can strike a match. We're here to fix what's broken, together." Even his critics couldn't deny it. Kennedy had mastered the art of the verbal knockout without ever raising his voice. Massie wanted a fight. Kennedy wanted a country that still remembered what governing meant. And in that chamber, it was clear which one mattered more. By noon, Kennedy's floor speech had lit up the airwaves. Clips flooded cable news, Fox played it with admiration, MSNBC called it a rare moment of Republican accountability, and social media was ablaze. But Kennedy wasn't basking in the attention. He was in his office, jacket off, tie loosened, meeting with two weary-looking aides. "He's on another podcast, Senator," one of them said, eyes glued to her laptop. "Massie's saying you've lost touch with the grassroots." Kennedy leaned back, rubbing his chin. "Lost touch, huh? I've spent 30 years shaking hands with the folks who actually live the consequences of bad policy. I doubt Tom's shaken anyone's hand that wasn't holding a microphone." His aide smirked, but Kennedy didn't. "He's not the problem," he continued, "he's a symptom. Folks are tired, angry, and scared, and people like Massie offer them noise instead of answers." Across the Capitol, Massie was doubling down, standing in front of a banner that read, "Defending Liberty, not Lobbyists." "Senator Kennedy says I'm making noise," Massie declared to the cameras. "Well, if the truth is noise, then maybe Washington needs a little more of it." His supporters erupted in cheers, feeding the narrative that he was the lone fighter in a corrupt system. Kennedy watched the clip later, shaking his head. "He's playing preacher with a hollow gospel," he muttered. "Plenty of passion, no plan." He turned to his communications director. "Get me on Face the Nation tomorrow. If he wants to talk about liberty, we'll talk about what it really costs." That night, Kennedy walked the empty halls of the Senate, the echo of his shoes trailing through marble silence. He paused under the rotunda, looking up at the painted dome. "This building's seen louder men than him," he murmured. None of them lasted long. The fight was no longer about two men, it was about two versions of conservatism, one that governed, and one that grandstand. And Kennedy was about to make sure the country saw the difference. Sunday morning came, and with it, the hum of television studios preparing for political theater. Senator John Kennedy adjusted his tie in the green room of Face the Nation, his reflection calm but sharp. "Senator, they're definitely going to bring up Massie," his aide whispered. Kennedy grinned. "Good. I was worried they'd waste my coffee on small talk." When the cameras rolled, Kennedy's tone was pure Louisiana steel, polite, but impossible to soften. "Senator Kennedy," the host began, "Representative Massie says you've abandoned conservative principles for political convenience. How do you respond?" Kennedy leaned forward slightly, his hands folded. "Well, bless his heart," he said, voice slow and deliberate. "Thomas is what we call in Louisiana high-octane confidence, low-octane results. He loves liberty so much he forgot it comes with responsibility." The studio fell quiet for a beat, then the host pressed, "Are you saying Congressman Massie isn't acting in good faith?" Kennedy didn't hesitate. I'm saying he's auditioning for applause when the country needs adults at the table. Leadership isn't about yelling the loudest, it's about getting something done. If Thomas wants to play cowboy, he can buy a ranch. But in Washington, you ride for the brand, or you get off the horse. The clip hit social media before the broadcast even ended. Kennedy torches Massie live on air, blared headlines. Conservative talk shows replayed the "buy a ranch" line like a rallying cry. Massie's team scrambled, releasing a statement calling Kennedy a relic of the political elite. But Kennedy didn't flinch. Let him talk, he told his staff later that day. Every time he opens his mouth, folks see who's serious and who's selling sound bites. That night, the senator sat alone on his porch back in Louisiana, listening to cicadas buzz through the warm air. You can't shout your way into history, he muttered, sipping sweet tea. You earn it, one hard truth at a time. By Monday morning, the internet had turned Kennedy's interview into political gold. Clips were stitched into memes, remixed into patriotic montages, and quoted in editorials across the spectrum. Conservative commentators praised him for restoring grown-up leadership, while others marveled at how one man could dismantle a grandstander without raising his voice. Kennedy's "buy a ranch" remark trended for hours. In his Kentucky office, Thomas Massie fumed. His aide sat awkwardly as he slammed his fist on the desk. He thinks he's better than me, Massie muttered. He's just a slick-talking swamp creature in cowboy boots. One aide spoke cautiously. Sir, with all due respect, the polls are shifting. Kennedy's approval is climbing, his speech hit a nerve. Massie glared. That's because people love theater. Fine. Let's give them a show. 2 days later, Massie staged a press conference on the Capitol steps. Cameras rolled as he waved a stack of papers. This is what I stand for: truth, freedom, and the Constitution. And if Senator Kennedy wants to mock that, maybe he's forgotten which side he's on. His supporters erupted, but the theatrics were too obvious. One reporter whispered, "He looks desperate." Meanwhile, Kennedy was in a committee meeting, focused on an infrastructure bill that would bring jobs to Louisiana. A staffer showed him Massie's outburst on her phone. Kennedy didn't even glance up. He's playing checkers, he said dryly. I'm playing chess. That evening, Kennedy's measured response appeared on Fox, Congressman Massie's welcome to his soapbox. I prefer a toolbox. The people of Louisiana sent me to fix things, not to audition for likes. The contrast was crystal clear. Massie barked, Kennedy built. One thrived on attention, the other on results. In an age where noise often drowned out wisdom, Kennedy's quiet authority spoke louder than any microphone could. Be why midweek, Washington insiders were whispering about what they called the Kennedy effect. While Massie's rants filled social feeds for a few hours before fading, Kennedy's words stuck. They were clipped, replayed, and quoted by pundits who described him as the adult in the room. Even Democratic commentators, usually allergic to conservative praise, admitted, grudgingly, that Kennedy's brand of blunt honesty had struck a chord. In a closed-door lunch with GOP colleagues, Kennedy sat at the head of the table as the conversation turned to the party's direction. One younger senator asked, "You really think calling out Massie publicly was the right move?" Kennedy leaned back, sipping his iced tea. Sometimes, son, the only way to stop a man from setting the barn on fire is to take away his matches. The room erupted in laughter, but the meaning was clear. Kennedy wasn't afraid to police his own side if it meant protecting the party's credibility. Meanwhile, Massie's inner circle was fraying. Leaked texts hit the press showing aides questioning his obsession with owning Kennedy. One message read, "He's turning this into a circus. Kennedy's making him look small." The story exploded on political blogs. Reporters swarmed Kennedy that afternoon. "Senator, what do you make of the leaked texts?" He smiled politely. "Well," he said with that familiar twang, "if you dig your own hole, you can't complain when people notice you're standing in it." The crowd laughed, and the quote instantly went viral. Back in his office, Kennedy turned serious with his chief of staff. "I don't enjoy this," he said quietly. "But I'll be damned if I let politics turn into performance art. This job's about people, not pride." Outside, cameras flashed, and the headlines blared. Kennedy ends Massie's crusade with one line. The lone wolf had howled for too long, and now, even his echo was starting to fade. By Thursday, the storm had broken, and Thomas Massie was drowning in it. His press secretary resigned live on X, citing irreconcilable differences in priorities. A former aide appeared on a political podcast, saying Massie's obsession with Kennedy had turned into a one-man show with no script. The headlines were merciless: Massie implodes under his own spotlight. Meanwhile, Senator John Kennedy was doing what he always did best, working. Inside a packed committee hearing, he sat at the center of a bipartisan discussion on energy reform, the kind of policy work that rarely made viral clips but changed lives in real ways. As a reporter shouted a question about Massie, Kennedy didn't even look up from his notes. "I'm more interested in power grids than power plays," he said calmly, and the room chuckled. That night, Kennedy appeared on a primetime political panel. The host, smiling slyly, asked, "Senator, it seems you've humbled one of your own. Any regrets about how public this feud has become?" Kennedy didn't miss a beat. "No, ma'am," he said, tone steady but firm. "If a man's gonna shout from the rooftops, he'd better be ready for folks to check if there's a roof under him. Politics ain't theater, it's stewardship. If you want applause, go join a band." The audience laughed, but the message was clear. Kennedy wasn't attacking Massie out of ego, he was drawing a line between leadership and showmanship. His words echoed across talk shows and morning news cycles, reframed as a lesson in political maturity. Back in Kentucky, Massie watched from his home office, the glow of the screen flickering against his tight jaw. "He's making me look like a fool," he muttered to no one in particular. The irony was painful: he'd wanted attention, and now the whole country was watching his unraveling. Kennedy, meanwhile, finished his night the way he often did, reading letters from constituents. "They still care," he murmured, scanning a note from a single mother in Lafayette. "They still believe someone's listening." He set the letter down, took a slow breath, and whispered, "And I'll be damned if I let the noise drown them out." Friday morning brought the final blow. A national poll hit the airwaves showing that 68% of Republican voters sided with Kennedy over Massie. The data was brutal: among independents, the gap widened even more. Kennedy's approval had surged, while Massie's had cratered. Every political show in America led with the same headline: "Kennedy's calm outsmarts Massie's chaos." In the Capitol cafeteria, staffers whispered over coffee. "Massie went too far," one said. Kennedy didn't even raise his voice, and he still buried him. In the Senate elevator, Kennedy's longtime colleague chuckled. "You turned that boy's tantrum into a masterclass, John." Kennedy smiled faintly. "I didn't turn it into anything. I just let him talk long enough for folks to hear what he really sounds like." Meanwhile, Thomas Massie was holed up in his office, blinds drawn, his phone buzzing with unanswered calls. The same journalists who once courted him now smelled blood. One headline read, "From Maverick to Meme, the Fall of Thomas Massie." Another, "The Lone Wolf has lost the pack." That afternoon, Kennedy took the floor again, but this time, there was no drama. Just quiet authority. "My mama used to say," he began, voice steady, "a man who mistakes volume for virtue will lose both before long. We can argue about taxes, we can argue about policy, but what we can't afford to argue about is the truth." The chamber was silent. No interruptions. No theatrics. Just the low hum of history being written. Kennedy continued, "America's tired of being shouted at. They want leaders who build, not bullies who bark. If we can't tell the difference, then maybe we're the problem." Outside, the press waited for a fiery exchange, but none came. Kennedy simply tipped his head, buttoned his jacket, and walked out through the marble corridor, his words still echoing in the chamber. Massie's era of noise had ended. Kennedy hadn't shouted him down, he'd outlasted him. By the weekend, the headlines had shifted. The story was no longer about Thomas Massie's outbursts, it was about Senator John Kennedy's unwavering composure. Major outlets ran op-eds calling him, the voice of reason in a circus of egos. Cable networks played his quote on repeat. If a man mistakes volume for virtue, he'll lose both before long. Across America, that line became more than a soundbite, it became a sentiment. From rural diners to university debate halls, people quoted Kennedy's words as a reminder that leadership wasn't about noise. It was about nerve. In Louisiana, Kennedy's home state, locals gathered at a small cafe where his televised interviews had become must-watch events. An old farmer nodded at the screen and said, "He's the only one talkin' sense left up there." Others agreed. They weren't just proud, they were inspired. Meanwhile, Massie's team quietly disbanded. His public appearances dwindled. His social media went silent. The man who'd sought the spotlight had vanished into its shadow. And yet, Kennedy never gloated. In a private moment with his staff, he said softly, "This was never about me. It was about reminding folks that principles don't bend just because the wind does." That night, Kennedy addressed a town hall in Baton Rouge. The crowd rose to their feet as he walked onto the stage, calm, humble, deliberate. He placed his notes aside and spoke from the heart. Politics ought to be a service, not a circus. And if telling the truth costs you friends in high places, then maybe those places ain't worth being in. The room erupted in applause. Cameras flashed. Hashtags trended again, this time not about conflict, but conviction. As Kennedy left the stage, he smiled faintly to his aide. "Let 'em keep their noise," he said. "We'll keep our country." And in that moment, one truth rang louder than any argument ever could. The lone wolf may howl, but the shepherd leads. Folks, I've seen a lot of noise in Washington lately. I've seen people confuse pride for purpose, and shouting for strength. But here's the truth, leadership ain't about being loud. It's about being right. It's about standing for something even when it ain't easy, even when it costs you. He pauses, letting the silence hang for a beat. I don't wake up thinking how to win a headline. I wake up thinking how to earn your trust. Some folks treat politics like a show, but where I come from, we treat it like a duty, a promise between people who still believe in right and wrong. His tone sharpens, carrying that unmistakable Southern steel. If you forget who you serve, you don't deserve to serve. And if you can't tell the truth to your own side, then you ain't fit to lead anybody's. The audience rises, clapping hard now, not just for the words, but for the weight behind them. Kennedy nods once, humbly. America don't need another performer. It needs patriots. It needs adults in the room. It needs men and women who love this country more than they love a microphone. He takes one last breath, eyes scanning the crowd. We've had enough howling from the lone wolves. It's time to get back to building, together. The noise fades, but the truth? The truth always echoes.